Deep in the Austrian Alps, in the spring of 1945, a group of salt miners arrived for what should have been an ordinary shift. They descended into the cool dark of the Altaussee mine the same way their fathers and grandfathers had. By lantern light, through passages carved over centuries, past walls that glistened with mineral crystal. What they found instead, stacked in chamber after chamber, wrapped in canvas and crated in wood, was the single largest collection of stolen art in human history. This is the story of what the monuments men pulled out of the Altaussee salt mine in 1945. 6,000 individuals' works of art, including some of the most irreplaceable paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts ever created by human hands. It is the story of how one man's obsession nearly destroyed everything in those tunnels, and how another group of men, working against time and against their own military commanders, managed to save it. What was hidden inside that mountain was not just treasure. It was evidence, the physical record of the greatest state-organized theft the world had ever seen. Adolf Hitler was not, in the conventional sense, a military strategist first. He was, in his own self-conception, an artist first, rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts before he redirected his ambitions toward politics. Hitler had a plan for the city of Linz, his hometown in Austria. He intended to build there the greatest art museum the world had ever seen, a monument to Germanic cultural supremacy he called the Führermuseum. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the operated across occupied Europe as a quasi-official looting bureau, systematically stripping Jewish collections, municipal museums, and private galleries of their holdings. Hermann Göring ran a parallel operation, feeding his own voracious personal appetite for art. But Hitler's Linz collection was always the crown project, its acquisitions catalogued and earmarked with bureaucratic precision. The salt mine near the village of Altaussee had been in continuous serration since the 14th century. Its underground chambers naturally climate-controlled at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, ideally suited to preserving canvas, panel painting, and aged paper. Beginning in 1943 and continuing through early 1945, a massive transfer operation moved hundreds of crates into the mine's interior. Mine administrator Emmerich Puckmüller oversaw the operation with meticulous record-keeping. The theory was explicit in Nazi ideology, that great art was the expression of Aryan civilization, and therefore belonged, by right, to the Germanic state, regardless of where it had been made or who had owned it. This was not an ad hoc rationalization. It was a fully developed theoretical position with its own literature, its own bureaucratic apparatus, and its own vocabulary of legitimization. When Captain Robert Posey and Private First Class Lincoln Kirstein, two members of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, first entered the Altaussee mine in mid-May 1945, they were not prepared for the scale of what they found. The art was distributed across 7 major chambers, some sealed with brick walls. The chambers were cathedral-like, their walls crystalline with salt, their air cool and still and faintly mineral. The first thing Posey and Kirsten encountered was the evidence of what had nearly happened. In late April, someone had smuggled 8 large wooden crates into the mine marked marble. They did not contain marble. They contained artillery shells. The man behind this attempted destruction was August Eigruber, the fanatical Nazi Gauleiter of Upper Austria, who issued the order as a scorched earth measure. If the Reich was falling, its treasures would not be surrendered to the enemy. Puckmüller and Seiberl, along with mine foreman Johann Högler and resistance member Albrecht Geiswinkler, took an extraordinary risk. They secretly removed the detonators from the bombs. They organized a crew of miners to physically remove the explosive krelits from the tunnel and take them out of the mine entirely. Gruber's order was never carried out. The mountain held. In the chamber known as the Springer work, wrapped carefully in its specially constructed crate, was Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, considered by many to be the foundational work of Western oil painting. It had been stolen from the Cathedral of St. Bavo in Ghent by the Nazis in 1942 and had traveled a long and terrifying route before arriving here. Posey and Kirstein had it brought out carefully into the light. Vermeer's The Astronomer had been the centerpiece of the Rothschild collection in Paris before being confiscated. Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, its white Carrara marble surface intact, unharmed, was there. There were works by Rembrandt, panels by Rogier van der Weyden, drawings by Dürer, manuscripts so old and fragile the officers were instructed to move them as infrequently as possible. The full inventory ran to more than 6,000 objects. The recorded weight of everything removed from the mine exceeded 100 tons. George Stout, who oversaw the physical extraction operation, later described the work in terms that stripped all romance from it. It was, he said, an engineering problem first and a conservation problem second. Getting paintings and sculptures out without damaging them required purpose-built stretchers, improvised carts, and careful humidity management as objects transitioned from the mine's cool, stable air to the variable Austrian spring outside. The team was small. Their equipment was inadequate. Their authority within the military hierarchy was perpetually contested by officers who had more pressing operational concerns than the preservation of old paintings. There were serious proposals, documented in the period's records, to simply transport the most valuable works to the United States for safekeeping. A euphemism the monuments men recognized immediately as the same logic the Nazis had used. James Rorimer had extracted crucial information from Rose Valland, a French resistance contact who had secretly documented Nazi looting operations from inside the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris throughout the occupation. Rorimer pushed back hard. The art was not war booty. It was the cultural patrimony of nations and individuals from whom it had been stolen, and it had to be returned. Official reports were filed and then routed through channels that made them effectively inaccessible. The scale of the internal debate over what to do with the art was not part of the public narrative that emerged in the immediate post-war years. The monuments men themselves, in private correspondence and post-war memoirs, were quite clear that the battle over the art did not end when the bombs were neutralized. It simply moved into conference rooms and cable traffic. The Ghent altarpiece was returned to Belgium. The Madonna of Bruges went back to Bruges. Vermeer's Astronomer was eventually returned to France and ultimately to the heirs of the Rothschild family. But of the 6,000-plus objects removed from Altaussee, a significant number were not returned to their rightful owners within any reasonable time frame. Some were held in American-controlled collection points for years. Some entered the post-war West German legal system, where restitution claims were adjudicated under laws that placed the burden of proof on the claimant in ways that were extraordinarily difficult to satisfy, particularly for families that had been murdered or dispersed. George Stout, writing after the war, described the task of restitution as one that would require not years but generations. He was correct. Restitution claims continue to be filed, litigated, and occasionally resolved in courts around the world today. Stout, in particular, kept meticulous field notes and photographs at a time, when others might have left the documentation to the military's official channels he had good reason not to fully trust. The miners at Altaussee, the men who had received the crates, worked alongside Nazi officials, and then quietly supported the removal of E. Gruber's bombs, told their stories to their families, and those families told them to researchers for decades. The oral accounts also preserve something the official record tends to flatten: the moral complexity of what happened at the mine level. The miners knew, to varying degrees, what they were helping to store and where it had come from. Altaussee was not unique. It was the most spectacular of what was in fact a widespread and systematic practice. The same Nazi looting infrastructure fed many other repositories across occupied Europe. The Merkers salt mine in Thuringia, discovered by American troops in April 1945, contained gold and currency reserves as well as art. The Bernterode mine contained the coffins of Prussian kings removed by Nazi officials who feared Allied bombing. The American collecting point at Munich, the central collecting point, established in the Führermuseum, the very building Hitler had used as his Munich headquarters, received and processed approximately 15,000 paintings alone. The monuments program operated in more than a dozen countries simultaneously, with a total personnel strength that never exceeded a few hundred individuals, museum curators, art historians, architects, and professors given nominal military rank and minimal equipment. That they accomplished what they did is a function not of institutional support, which was consistently inadequate, but of individual knowledge, individual determination, and individual moral commitment. Those 6,000 objects in those salt chambers were not abstractions. They were the Ghent altarpiece. They were the Madonna of Bruges. They were drawings Dürer made with his own hand. The Nazi project had attempted to redefine that inheritance, to assert it belonged not to humanity in common, but to a racial state that had the right to possess it, and ultimately to destroy it if display became inconvenient. The monument's men, and the Austrian miners who defused those bombs before them, said something different. They said, "This belongs to the people who made it, and to the people it was taken from, and to the world that comes after us. We do not have a complete accounting. We likely never will." The Nazis destroyed or lost records. Thousands of works that passed through the ERR and the Linz collection program remain unlocated today. Every few years, a cache surfaces in a German apartment, or a provenance researcher traces a work in a legitimate institution back to a forced sale in Vienna in 1938, and the machinery of restitution grinds forward another small step. Sometimes the past surfaces through a tunnel mouth in the mountains, where men carrying lanterns move through the cool mineral dark and find, stacked in chamber after chamber, the evidence that someone tried to own what could not be owned. The miners who went down into Altaussee in the spring of 1945 expected an ordinary shift. They came up into the light of a world trying to remember what it had almost lost. Some of what they helped carry out that day is hanging now in churches and museums where it belongs. Some of it is still waiting to come home. The tunnels are still there, deep in the Salzkammergut, the mountain held.